Every air defense system ever built by any nation that has ever fielded one contains a fundamental architectural tension that no engineer has ever fully resolved. The tension is this: the system must be able to distinguish, at speed, between aircraft that belong to the force it is protecting and aircraft that intend to harm it. The mechanism used to make that distinction is called identification friend, or foe. A challenge and response protocol in which a defending radar system interrogates an approaching contact and receives, or does not receive, an encrypted transponder reply that confirms the contact as a friendly asset. If the reply is correct, the contact is classified as friendly. If the reply is absent or incorrect, the contact is classified as unknown or hostile and enters the engagement decision chain. The tension in this architecture is not technical. The technology works. The tension is philosophical. The system is designed to trust a signal, and a signal, unlike a physical object, can be reproduced by anyone who knows what it is supposed to say. The Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security had known what the U.S. Navy's Mode 5 IFF transponder was supposed to say for 8 months before the Sunday night that came closest to ending a carrier strike group in the Arabian Sea. Without a single missile being fired from a shore-based battery, they had known it because 8 months earlier, in a mountainous region of southeastern Iran where the terrain was complex enough to confuse the navigation systems of autonomous aircraft operating near the limits of their operational envelope, a U.S. Navy RQ-4C Triton maritime surveillance drone conducting a routine patrol mission had experienced a GPS signal degradation event that its onboard fault recovery system had not been able to fully compensate for. The drone had not crashed. It had landed, softly, autonomously, correctly following its lost link landing protocol, in a dry riverbed 3 kilometers inside Iranian territory, rather than in the international airspace corridor it had been trying to return to. The Iranian military had reached it within 4 hours. In the subsequent 6 hours, before the U.S. Navy's own classified loss assessment had concluded that the drone's cryptographic erase protocol had functioned correctly, an Iranian electronic intelligence team had extracted from the drone's intact avionics bay a set of hardware components that the erase protocol had been designed to protect, but had not been designed for the physical access the team achieved. The erase protocol was software. The hardware it ran on was solid-state memory that, under the right laboratory conditions, retained residual data states that forensic recovery tools could partially reconstruct even after the erase cycle had completed. What they recovered was not complete. It was not the full encryption key set for the Mode 5 IFF system's current operational codes. The codes rotated on a schedule that meant even a complete key recovery would have a limited operational window. What they recovered was the algorithmic structure of the key generation process, not the keys themselves, but the mathematical architecture that produced them. That architecture, analyzed by the Iranian cryptographic team over a period of 4 months, was sufficient to allow a team with significant computational resources to narrow the key space for any given operational period from an effectively infinite set to a computationally feasible one. Feasible not in seconds, but in hours. Given the right hardware, it was enough. With the right hardware, which Iran had acquired through a procurement channel that routed through 3 intermediate nations and arrived in the country as components for a civilian telecommunications research program, the team could derive a valid Mode 5 IFF response code for any given operational period within approximately 4 to 6 hours of the period beginning. The derived code would not be certain. It was a probabilistic derivation from a partially recovered algorithmic structure, not a clean key extraction. But it would be correct with a probability the team assessed as between 71 and 84% for any given interrogation cycle. High enough to be operationally useful. High enough to pass the IFF check that stood between an incoming aircraft and being classified as hostile. The aircraft they chose to use was a modified version of the Shahed series airframe. not the one-way attack variant that had become familiar through its use in the European theater, but a heavier, longer-range variant that the Iranian aerospace program had been developing in parallel for a different mission set. The modifications included a Mode 5 compatible transponder unit, an electronic warfare package capable of rebroadcasting the derived code in response to radar interrogations, and a radar cross-section management system that reduced the airframe's return to a profile consistent with a small, fixed-wing reconnaissance aircraft, rather than the attack platform it actually carried. The warhead was not conventional. It was a penetrating shaped charge design specifically engineered for the armor profile of a carrier island superstructure. The command and control nerve center above the flight deck, whose loss would not sink the ship but would functionally remove its ability to coordinate its own defense. The operation was not designed to destroy the carrier. It was designed to blind it at the moment a conventional strike arrived. The full operational plan had two phases. Phase 1 was the IFF spoofing aircraft, launched from a position south of the Iranian coast, flying a carefully planned approach route that kept it in airspace consistent with a U.S. surveillance asset returning from a patrol, querying the carrier's IFF system in a way that would return the derived code and produce a friendly classification. The aircraft would approach the carrier on a flight profile indistinguishable from a returning surveillance drone, penetrate the carrier's defensive perimeter under friendly classification, and strike the island at the moment the carrier's crew were managing the normal tempo of night flight operations. Phase 2, launching simultaneously with Phase 1's final approach, was a salvo of 31 anti-ship cruise missiles from shore-based batteries, timed to arrive at the carrier's position in the 11-minute window after the island strike, when the ship's command and control architecture would be in its most disrupted state. The timing was precise. The geometry had been computed against the carrier's established operating pattern, which the Iranian intelligence picture had tracked for 19 days through a combination of satellite observation, signals collection, and the monitoring of the carrier's routine communications traffic. The plan had one design flaw that its architects had considered, assessed as acceptable risk, and been wrong about. The flaw was this: a Mode 5 IFF response that is correct 71 to 84% of the time is correct between 16 and 29% of the time incorrectly. A system that queries a contact multiple times will eventually receive an incorrect response. The carrier's Aegis system, tracking all airborne contacts in its defensive perimeter, did not query each contact once. It queried continuously, at an interval determined by the contact's range, bearing rate, and threat classification. A contact approaching on a profile consistent with a returning surveillance asset at the range and speed the spoofing aircraft was flying would be queried approximately once every 40 seconds during its terminal approach phase. The spoofing aircraft entered the carrier strike group's outer perimeter at 11:22 p.m. It had been flying for 2 hours and 17 minutes on its approach profile. It had passed 17 separate IFF interrogation queries from the outer screen destroyer's radar systems during that approach, returning a valid derived code on 14 of them and an incorrect code on 3. The 3 incorrect responses had been attributed by the automated classification system to transponder signal propagation issues, a common cause of intermittent IFF response failures in electronic environments, as congested as the Arabian Sea operating area. The contact had remained classified as friendly throughout. At 11:22 p.m., the contact entered the inner defensive perimeter, the zone where the carrier's own radar and fire control systems assumed primary tracking responsibility. The carrier's system queried the contact at 11:22 p.m. and 41 seconds. The derived code returned was correct. The contact remained classified as friendly. It was logged as a returning surveillance asset and assigned a recovery holding pattern consistent with standard approach sequencing. At 11:24 p.m. and 03 seconds, the carrier system queried again. The derived code returned was incorrect. A single incorrect IFF response on a contact that had been correctly identified 17 times in the preceding 2 hours was not by itself an alert condition. The automated system logged the failed response, flagged the contact for the next query cycle, and continued its tracking function. The Air Intercept Controller on watch noted the flag in his display queue and moved on to the 11 other contacts he was managing in the same scan cycle. At 11:24 p.m. and 44 seconds, the carrier system queried again. The derived code returned was incorrect. 2 consecutive failed responses on a contact inside the inner defensive perimeter was an alert condition. The automated system elevated the contact from friendly to unknown and generated an alert tone in the Combat Information Center. The Air Intercept Controller had the alert at 11:24 p.m. and 46 seconds, 2 seconds after the second failed response. In those 2 seconds, the contact had traveled approximately 300 meters closer to the carrier on its current approach vector. He did not wait for a third query. He had been trained on the IFF spoofing threat scenario in a classified exercise 14 months earlier. An exercise that had been specifically designed around the architectural vulnerability of probabilistic code derivation and the multi-query exposure problem. The exercise had burned into his professional memory one specific datum. A contact inside the inner defensive perimeter that generates 2 consecutive IFF failures is not a transponder glitch. A transponder glitch does not occur twice in a row at the same contact range in the same query cycle. Transponder glitches are random. 2 consecutive failures are a pattern. He called the contact hostile at 11:24 p.m. and 49 seconds, 3 seconds after the second failed response. The Combat Information Center went to weapons free on the contact at 11:24 p.m. and 53 seconds. The first RAM missile launched at 11:24 p.m. and 57 seconds, before the contact had completed the maneuver that would have brought its warhead within effective detonation range of the carrier's island. The rolling airframe missile engaged the spoofing aircraft at 11:25 p.m. and 12 seconds. The detonation occurred at a range that produced a debris field extending to approximately 800 meters from the carrier's port beam. 3 fragments of the aircraft's airframe struck the carrier's hull above the waterline, not penetrating, not causing structural compromise, but leaving visible impact marks on the hull plating that the damage assessment team would document as evidence of how close the engagement had been. The island was intact. The command and control architecture was intact. The carrier's crew was at general quarters at 11:25 p.m. and 31 seconds, 19 seconds after the IFF spoofing aircraft was engaged. The signals intelligence platform covering the Iranian coastal defense network detected the launch signatures of 31 cruise missiles from shore-based batteries on the Makran coast. The launches were simultaneous, within a 4-second window, from 5 separate battery positions. The Phase 2 strike had launched on schedule. Its schedule assumed the carrier's island had already been struck and its command architecture degraded. The carrier's command architecture was not degraded. Its tactical action officer had been at her station for 31 minutes in general quarters posture. The preloaded engagement solutions for a Makran coast cruise missile strike, solutions that had been computed as part of the standard threat response planning for Arabian Sea operations and updated 48 hours earlier based on the latest intelligence assessment of Iranian coastal battery positions, were already in the system. The SM-2 and SM-6 launches from the outer screen destroyers began at 11:27 p.m. and 14 seconds. The Iranian planners had computed their Phase 2 engagement timeline against a carrier whose point defense aircraft, the E/A-18G Growlers that would jam cruise missile guidance links, were not airborne. The aircraft were not airborne because the Phase 1 strike was supposed to have disrupted flight operations by the time Phase 2 arrived. The Growlers were not airborne, but the carrier had reacted to the general quarters condition at 11:24 p.m. and 53 seconds. and the flight deck crew had the first Growler at the catapult by 11:29 p.m. The aircraft launched at 11:31 p.m., 4 minutes after Phase 2 missiles were in the air, with a time-to-intercept range of approximately 18 minutes before the missiles reached the carrier's defensive perimeter. 18 minutes was enough. 2 Growlers airborne by 11:34 p.m. Their jamming systems activated at 11:36 p.m. against the crew's missile guidance frequencies. Of the 31 missiles, 19 lost mid-course guidance within 4.8 seconds of jamming activation and reverted to inertial navigation against stale targeting coordinates. The inertial solutions placed their terminal approach against the carrier's position as of the moment their guidance had been locked, a position the carrier had moved away from by executing a 22-knot course change at 11:26 p.m. as a standard anti-missile maneuvering protocol. 19 missiles flew to coordinates the carrier was no longer at. The remaining 12 retained sufficient guidance connectivity to continue tracking. They were engaged by SM-2 and SM-6 from 3 destroyers in overlapping intercept arcs. 9 were intercepted in the mid-range engagement zone. 2 were intercepted in the inner zone. The last surviving missile, the 12th, was engaged by the carrier's own CIWS system at 11:44 p.m. and 22 seconds, at a range that the watch officer on the bridge later documented in his log without elaboration, because the number itself communicated everything that needed to be said. The CIWS engagement lasted 2.1 seconds. The debris from the detonation fell into the sea directly off the carrier's starboard bow. The splash was visible from the bridge. At 11:45 p.m., the Arabian Sea returned to the particular darkness that follows an engagement when the threat tracks have all resolved and the radar picture shows nothing new inbound. The CIC watch team began their assessment cycle. The tactical action officer confirmed weapons tight at 11:46 p.m. The Air Intercept Controller, who had called the spoofing aircraft hostile at 11:24 p.m. and 49 seconds, was still at his station. He had been at his station for 4 hours. He would be at his station for another 2. He had not raised his voice during the engagement. He had made one call in the 3rd second after the second consecutive IFF failure that had given the carrier 19 seconds it would not otherwise have had. In the geometry of what followed, 19 seconds was the distance between a functional command architecture and a struck one. 19 seconds was the Growlers getting airborne. 19 seconds was the difference in the mathematics of the final missile count. He logged his engagement actions at 11:52 p.m. and returned to monitoring his display. At 12:30 a.m., the intelligence team completed its preliminary assessment of the spoofing aircraft's recovered transponder components, which had survived the detonation in a partially intact state and been recovered from the sea surface by a rescue swimmer deployed from the carrier. The component analysis confirmed the Mode 5 compatible hardware configuration and the derived code architecture that the Iranian cryptographic team had spent 4 months developing from the partially recovered RQ-4C avionics data 8 months earlier. The assessment reached the Naval Cryptologic and Signals Intelligence Program Office at 2:15 a.m. The Mode 5 key rotation schedule was advanced by 48 hours as an immediate protective measure. The algorithmic structure vulnerability identified in the assessment was flagged for priority remediation. The hardware forensics from the Triton drone loss 8 months earlier were pulled from archive and re-examined against the new information. The re-examination took 11 days and produced a complete reconstruction of exactly what the Iranian recovery team had extracted from the drone's avionics bay in the 6 hours after its landing. The reconstruction was sobering. The partial recovery had been assessed at the time as insufficient to represent a meaningful cryptographic threat. The assessment had been wrong. The partial recovery had been sufficient for someone patient enough and computationally resourced enough to spend 4 months working with it. At 3 a.m., the carrier resumed standard flight operations. The flight deck crew worked in the darkness with the efficiency of professionals for whom the night's events had not disrupted the operational routine, but had simply been a part of it. Aircraft recovered and launched. The cycle continued. The Arabian Sea was dark and the stars were clear above it, and the ship moved through the water at its operating speed. Now the accounting. One RQ-4C Triton drone recovered intact by Iranian forces 8 months prior. One partial Mode 5 IFF algorithmic structure extracted from drone avionics. 4 months of Iranian cryptographic computation to derive operational codes. 17 IFF query cycles passed by the spoofing aircraft during its 2-hour approach. 3 incorrect responses during outer perimeter transit, attributed to propagation issues. 2 consecutive incorrect responses inside the inner defensive perimeter at 11:24 p.m. 3 seconds between the second failed response and a hostile classification call. 19 seconds between hostile classification and the RAM missile launch. 1 spoofing aircraft engaged by RAM at 11:25 p.m. 3 airframe fragments impacting carrier hull above waterline, no penetration. 31 cruise missiles launched from Makran coast on Phase 2 timeline. 19 lost mid-course guidance to Growler jamming within 4.8 seconds. 9 intercepted in mid-range engagement zone. 2 intercepted in inner zone. 1 engaged by CIWS off the starboard bow. 0 ships lost. 0 critical casualties. 1 Mode 5 key rotation advanced 48 hours. 1 Air Intercept Controller who understood that 2 consecutive failures are not a glitch. The Iranian operation had solved a problem that most adversaries treat as unsolvable. The IFF architecture that has protected carrier strike groups for decades had been analytically penetrated, not broken, not defeated, but approached closely enough that an aircraft flying on a derived code had passed 17 consecutive challenges from the outer defensive layer without being classified as hostile. The penetration was genuine. It deserved to be acknowledged as such. It failed at the 18th query, not because the 18th derived code was more likely to fail than the 17th. It failed because the 18th and 19th queries occurred inside the inner defensive perimeter, where the query interval was shorter, the attention density was higher, and a watch officer who had trained for exactly this failure mode was present and was not going to attribute 2 consecutive failures to propagation issues. In air defense, the system that trusts a signal must also be staffed by people who know when to stop trusting it. The signal can be spoofed. The trained recognition of the moment the spoof breaks down cannot be. That recognition, on this Sunday night, cost the adversary 4 months of cryptographic work, an airframe, and a Phase 2 strike that arrived at a command architecture that had 19 extra seconds to prepare for it. 19 seconds does not sound like a margin. It was the entire margin. The sea holds no memory of the debris field off the starboard bow. It closed over the wreckage before the watch rotation changed. What it does not close over is the standard. The practiced, daily, undramatic standard of attention that puts the right person at the right console at the moment. When 2 consecutive numbers in a log are the difference between what happened and what almost did.